Lovely to see many of you who have come to prior sessions during the summit. For those of you who I've not met before, I'm Dr. Tia Rich, and I have the pleasure of directing the Contemplation by Design Summit. This year we are fortunate to have tonight's speaker, Professor Blakey Vermeule. She's also the chair of the Stanford English Department, and I learned of her wisdom when her book, Action versus Contemplation, was featured in a Stanford Report news article. I reached out to her and she kindly agreed to share her insights and some of her content from her book in this year's summit. As many of you know, one of the gifts of a true teacher is the ability to address age-old problems that humanity faces in language and in terms that speak to the present moment and to the current situation. And from what I have experienced of Professor Vermeule, that is her gift. So without further ado, let's give her a warm welcome for her session tonight, and I give her a small gift of gratitude.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind.
So that she can enjoy a cup of tea.
Oh, excellent. That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's very kind. Hello, everybody. I'm very, very pleased and really happy to be here with you all tonight. I have been thinking about the question of action and contemplation for a very long time, in part because my friend Jennifer Summit and I taught for many years a class here at Stanford on this question. It was a freshman class. It was taught under the auspices of IHUM, and thanks to Ellen Woods, who made it possible for us to explore these questions. And when we were done teaching the class, I think we taught it altogether for about 4 years, we really felt that we hadn't quite understood the topic, because ultimately it's so deep and so connected to the history of Western philosophy that we wanted to try to write a book that would help us explore a little bit some of the questions. And really what we discovered is that this question of action and contemplation goes right back to the very beginning of Western thought. So I'm going to read you a few passages from the book, and then I'd like us to maybe open up the floor for discussion. So I'll start with the introduction. Once upon a time, there were some ants. They gathered food all summer and laid up stores for the winter. The ants were small, but they worked together so that everyone would have enough for the long season ahead. Meanwhile, their neighbor, the grasshopper, spent the summer hopping around in the sun. Winter is coming, they warned him. You'd better prepare. The grasshopper just laughed. I live in the moment. You should stop to enjoy life too, rather than wasting it in mindless work. But the ants just worked harder. When winter came, the ants settled in with their supplies, and the grasshopper had nothing. Hungry and cold, he turned to his neighbors for help, but they had only enough for themselves and nothing to spare. In the summer, it looked like we were wasting our lives, the ants told him. Now you know that we were saving them. Once upon a time, there were some ants who spent the fine summer of their short and precious lives toiling in Pharaoh's army, marching robotically to the monotonous beat of the same tinny drum, unable to think for themselves, much less to suck the marrow out of life. They worshipped such dreary neoliberal quasi-virtues as efficiency, outcomes, best practices, and the corporate ethos. They hired consultants, and they put stopwatches on the shop floor. The grasshopper was appalled. Nobody in ant world ever seemed to have a free moment to think or to reflect, much less to play or to enjoy. Efficient they might be, but they were hardly creative and far from happy. As for laying up stores for the winter, surely, thought the grasshopper, it is better to be happy now and to play catch as catch can later. Some stories work their way into the collective consciousness, and they never really work their way out again. The Ant and the Grasshopper is a story that comes to us from antiquity. Yet these characters are hardly just characters in an agrarian tale about the need to be prudent during times of feast in anticipation of coming famine. A story that would have made much more sense to our chronically hungry ancestors than to our overfed selves. Rather, they represent, in the words of William Blake, two contrary states of the soul. The ant and the grasshopper personify traits possessed by all people: the urge to step back, to consider the shortness of our lives and the smallness and our smallness in the cosmos, to experience life rather than to waste it, versus the need to act in the service of the greater good, to contribute to something bigger than ourselves, to help others endure the struggles that we all share. I think most of us experience both impulses regularly, sometimes in conflict, sometimes intertwined. Yet the way we now understand this story, it's come down to us as a kind of harsh moral fable. So you either live like an ant or you die like a grasshopper. You work for the future or you find yourself in a desperate pass. The choice is starkly clear. In my lived experience, by contrast, it is downright murky. I aspire, often not successfully, to finding grasshopper-like enjoyment and fulfillment in my daily work. And even the most ant-like among us can't easily square the ant's virtuous work ethic with their coldness and lack of charity. Yet, I think as children, we learn to see work and pleasure through the divisive lens of either or. The story of the ant and the grasshopper has woven itself so tightly into the fabric of the modern Western mind. Around this fable cluster many of our culture's most pressing myths, conversations, and collective freakouts. I don't know if you remember, there was a moment about 10 years ago when a law professor at Yale named Amy Chua published a book called The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. This was a very famous book, and there was a sort of collective howl that went up coast to coast when her book was published. She more or less claimed in her book that Asian children are more successful than other children because non-Asian and especially white parents indulge their children rather than teaching them discipline. So this fable concerns itself rather primally with character development, which is central to child rearing, two areas flooded by rivers of advice, much of it quite harsh and moralizing and scary. In this book, my co-author and I try not to offer any advice. Instead, we offer a larger intellectual context for these two contrary states of the soul and the issues that this fable, to my mind, it's still a very living fable, brings to life. And this context is the ancient debate between the active life and the contemplative life. To the extent that this debate goes back into the roots of Western philosophy, it's concerned with certain core questions. Which is more valuable, knowledge or action? Which is the greater achievement, wisdom or material success? Which is best, a life of active accomplishment or a life of spiritual or intellectual contemplation? Are action and contemplation necessarily at odds, or can we hope to achieve a balance between them? These questions have been debated and refined in the works of the world's great thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, Shakespeare and Thoreau, George Eliot and Hannah Arendt, but they are still intimately and uncomfortably familiar to all of us, to our students as they choose courses, declare fields of study, and attempt to chart their own paths, and also to ourselves. My coworker and I have found ourselves being asked about the action-contemplation debate on and off campus by friends, by colleagues, alumni and family, people who felt that it described some acute conflicts in their own lives. We experienced such tensions ourselves. When we first taught the course, we were two newly tenured literature professors at Stanford with plentiful resources, a position about as close to the contemplative vocation as modern capitalism allows. Yet, along with the freedom to contemplate, the security of tenure brought to both of us a sense of responsibility to act, to confront questions that had become increasingly uncomfortable for both of us. We saw over the course of the time that we were teaching this course, and even more especially since 2008, since the financial collapse, we saw fewer and fewer students choosing to major in the humanities, and we wondered how we could articulate the value of these seemingly impractical fields, or if we should, given the insecure workplace our Ph.D. students faced. But I think where we came to is the idea that we were convinced that this question is too vital to be confined to the archives or to the classroom. It really is a topic that is limitless. There's no fixed point on which it rests. Probably the most striking thing about this debate is that it never should have started. Aristotle sort of tried to end it before it began. Those of you who enjoy classical philosophy, you might go back and take a look at Aristotle's defense of contemplation in the Nicomachean Ethics. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful work. He says directly and clearly that contemplation, the Greek word is theoria, is the highest state of human flourishing, eudaimonia. Contemplation is the highest human good because it is self-sufficient, continuous. We are more capable of continuous study than of any other sort of activity, and complete on its own. Unlike most actions we undertake, contemplation aims at no end beyond itself. We do it for its own sake. Therefore, it is the most perfect of the virtues and the most conducive to happiness. So, why don't we all practice it? Well, that's a good question. I'd like to take up a question that I think about a great deal, I spend a lot of time thinking about and studying human cognition, and especially human cognitive biases. This is something that I've sort of made the center of my scholarly career. And what I'm fascinated by is how modern market society and corporate capitalism engages in what we might call bias capture. So it's not a secret to anybody in this room that modern market society strongly encourages utilitarian calculation, and it demands technocratic efficiency. So contemporary post-industrial capitalist societies more or less ask us to treat other people as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves. There's an Italian psychiatrist whose work I really like. He writes very movingly on the power of kindness, and he says that we're now in a global ice age of kindness and compassion. It's a sort of post-industrial ice age for complicated reasons involving industrialization and so forth. But the question that has been sort of at the heart of this debate is how do we fashion selves that we can admire and can live with when we are more or less asked by our economic conditions to treat other people as instruments? How much of this mindset is an illusion? And how do we, in a way, get to terms with the fact that the modern world plays tricks on many of our intuitions, often in ways that harm us? So we know this. We know, for instance, that we crave sugar because of ecological constraints faced by our ancestors, yet sugar in the modern world is in oversupply. As empty calories become cheaper to produce than nutrient-rich foods, obesity swells into a global epidemic. So I think that there's a sort of related, what we might call bias capture in the modern world. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I'm going to call it the action bias. So maybe I'll pause here and see if there are any comments or questions before I get into the sort of technical piece of my my presentation. Does anybody? Yes, go ahead. Okay, well,
Please repeat the question.
yes, could you say bias capture in simpler words? Well, I think what I mean is that, maybe I'll, let me see if I can. So I think it is now clear to many psychologists that we have what might amount to certain kinds of evolved cognitive traits. And these evolved cognitive traits evolved in a world very different from the one in which we now live. Often the modern world is at odds with the traits as they evolved in what we might call our ancestral past. So if we think about our craving for sugar, that's a very good example of a trait that served us extremely well at certain points in our past, but doesn't necessarily serve us so well now. So what I'm going to talk about is what I call the action bias. And I think that this is it's by analogy to the case of sugar. I think that the modern world encourages a bias or a sort of feature of our cognitions that might have served us well in the past, but that now actually makes it easy for us to feel somewhat alienated from our surroundings. So here, yes, go ahead, sorry.
Are you saying that the bias capture is equivalent to action bias, or action bias is an example of the bias capture?
I think that action bias, the bias towards action, is, and it's actually a sort of a series of kinds of cognitive biases. Is an instance of bias capture by the modern world. So I think what I'm going to say is going to sound very pessimistic, but I don't mean it to. I think the more we're sort of aware of our predicament, the more we're aware of our condition, the easier it is maybe to try to help ourselves out of it. So. Here's a terrible paradox. The less certain we find ourselves, the more we crave certainty and control. And the more we crave certainty, the more we try to take matters into our own hands. My interest in this topic actually began, I'm a soccer fan. I love the Premier League. I love watching soccer. I always have my whole life. And I've always been interested in the case of elite soccer goalkeepers. So if you're a soccer fan, like I am, there's something that you dread more than anything else, and that's penalty shootouts, which are used to break ties, often in important games with vast amounts of money and prestige at stake. So opposing goalkeepers each face a series of kickers and are most often humiliated. The kicker stands 36 feet away and fires the ball at speeds up to 80 miles an hour towards a net 24 feet wide. The goalkeeper has only 0.2 of a second to work out what to do, and usually has to commit himself before the kick is launched. But even with these many advantages, kickers sometimes miss or have their shots blocked. When that happens, the shame can linger for decades. To save everybody a great deal of pain, the referee should probably just let the match be decided by a coin toss. But games, we know, are not rational. They often fail, as economists delicately put it, to maximize their own utility. So in 2007, a team of Israeli behavioral economists published a paper about how elite goalkeepers defend against penalty kicks. This is a sort of fascinating question. How do you deal with this situation? Goalkeepers, they showed, are often their own worst enemies. They make a difficult task even harder by trying to do something, anything, to solve it. The economists' findings were written up in many different venues. But what they more or less discovered is that goalkeepers would actually have the best chance of stopping a penalty kick if they did nothing, if they just stood right in the center of the goal and just waited for the kick to come. But in fact, most goalies don't do that. Often before they see the kick coming, they lunge to the left or to the right, which makes their chances of stopping the ball worse. When asked, most goalies actually reported feeling worse about missing penalty kicks when they just stood there than when they lunged to one side or another. If they were going to fail, they said, it's better to go down doing something than standing still and looking weak. Yet in the end, they end up worse off than if they had done nothing. So this is something that social scientists call action bias. Now, the action part of it is interesting, but I want to spend a moment talking about the word bias. This is a word that means something very specific in social psychology. We all know that compared to computers, humans are notoriously bad at reasoning. We often take quick and easy mental shortcuts, but not just quick and easy, often false. Our mental shortcuts tend to be self-serving and overly optimistic. These shortcuts are called cognitive biases, and they can be very, very hard to understand or to correct. The systematic study of cognitive biases began really in Israel in the 1960s when two young researchers, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, started asking questions about how people reason. Their research program over the past several decades has yielded enormous fruit. They invented a new academic field. They turned out new research agendas across the social sciences, and Kahneman garnered a Nobel Prize in economics. Tversky, who was a Stanford professor, having died some years before. So there are many, many examples of such biases. But I'm very interested in the question of how biases sort of fare in the modern world. And there's actually one bias, cognitive bias, that stands out above the rest, and indeed I think explains why so many other biases are common, and this is called the illusion of control. So this was first identified by a Harvard professor named Ellen Langer in 1975, and it's the tendency, as she put it somewhat dryly, to, quote, assume a skill orientation in chance situations. So her example is that in a casino, people behave as though furrowing their brows, blowing into their hands, or throwing extra hard or soft will make the dice roll go their way. In sports, if you're a sports fan, the illusion of control can lead to some funny rituals. Pitchers often go through an elaborate set routine before pitching, pinching the rosin bag, running their toe just so over the pitching rubber, or touching parts of their uniform in sequence. Wade Boggs, the great Red Sox third baseman, ate chicken before every game, and whole websites chronicle the quirks and superstitions of professional athletes, including Serena Williams, who is said to wear the same pair of socks throughout a tournament. Well, it turns out that this illusion of control is actually more prevalent when we feel lost, when we feel at sea. So the less control we have in a situation, the more likely we are to seek to stabilize the world around us by engaging in this cognitive bias. The anthropologist Bruno Malinowski discovered, this was a famous discovery, that tribes of the Trobriand Islands who fish in the deep sea, where sudden storms and unmapped waters are constant concerns, have far more rituals associated with fishing than do those who fish in shallow waters. The illusion of control is a really profound way that we have of trying to impose order onto a world that seems chaotic, scary, or out of control. And actually, many social psychologists have done experiments that have repeated these findings. So some of my sort of favorite ones involve researchers asking people to find patterns in pictures from which computers had eliminated any trace of anything like a pattern or an embedded image. And in those experiments, the less control people had over their performance on the task, the more likely they were to see patterns where none existed. They were also more likely to find conspiracies in stories, and when told that the stock market was volatile, to overestimate the amount of negative information available about fictional companies. So over and over again, social psychologists have shown us that experiencing a loss of control leads people to desire more structure and to perceive illusory patterns in patternless states. So even exposure to absurdist art can have this effect. One study found that participants who were exposed to absurdist art, or even reminders of our own mortality in the form of stories by Kafka or Monty Python, reported higher scores on the personal need for structure scale, suggesting that they experienced a heightened need for meaning. I think, so one of the arguments of this book, or one of the things that we try to diagnose in this book, is that, sure, pattern seeking and ritual behavior seem harmless enough if they're triggered in experimental conditions. However, the illusion of control can actually feed intuition so strong that their grip is devilishly hard to break. Most people feel safer, and I'm sure you've heard some of these studies, if they are directly in control, yet it's actually much safer to fly on a jet that's piloted by somebody else than it is to drive to the airport. The whole industries, including, I believe, the gun lobby and certain car makers, have notoriously exploited this intuition to our collective detriment. So many people keep guns at home because they feel that guns protect their families from intruders, but the reverse is actually true. bringing a gun into the house is the fastest way to put your family and children at risk. So rates of suicide, homicide, and accidental deaths spike dramatically if there are firearms in the house. As Matthew Miller, a Harvard epidemiologist, put it, if you bought a gun today, I could tell you the risk of suicide to you and your family member is going to be 2 to 10-fold higher over the next 20 years. There are not many things you can do to increase your risk of dying tenfold. So too with SUV ownership in the 1990s. Advertising campaigns relentlessly stoked the idea that we were most threatened by other drivers and by foul weather, hostile forces outside ourselves, but people could thus sort of ignore data about rollover risks. So one of the things that I'm really fascinated by is how contemporary market capitalism actually exploits this feeling of needing to do something, of needing to try to control our environment in ways that actually make us worse off. So that's the pessimistic part of the talk. Maybe I'll stop here and see if you have any questions about this, and then I'm going to turn to an optimistic ending. At least I think it's optimistic. I hope I haven't bummed you out. Yeah.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the thrust of your remarks is that contemplation is better than action.
Well, so far the thrust of my remarks have been that that contemporary market society pushes us in all kinds of ways to believe that action is superior to contemplation, and actually does so in part by what we might call harvesting certain cognitive biases that we have in favor of doing things and in favor of acting. So I have long been interested in this question of actually does doing something, well, let me put it this way, that I'm not entirely sure at this point in my life that doing things, or what we might call the pervasive ideology of solutionism in American capitalism, and especially in Silicon Valley, actually makes us better off. So, but my bias, I should tell you, is that it's true that I am a long-time contemplative, and I try very, very hard to fight against this tendency in myself, because I really recognize it, and I recognize that so many of our sort of consumerist conditions are pushing us constantly to solve this, solve that, do this, do that. And I think that the analogy in my mind is to our consumption of sugar. So that's the case that I'm trying to make.
But
Yeah.
on the other hand, if one looks at the history of civilization,
Yeah.
just pure contemplation or speculation can lead to basically dead ends. And scientific method requires piece of experiment, which is a kind of action.
Yeah.
And also there is also tradition of feeling that too much contemplation can lead to paralysis and do nothing to address serious
Yeah.
society.
Do you want to? So, I'm a humanist and an academic, and I have heard this my whole life. Right. This view goes all the way back to Plato. It's very, very ancient. The view that philosophy, contemplation, reflection, inwardness is something that is really, it's useless and sometimes worse than useless. That it's something that is okay for children, but not for adults. That really the sort of mature human personality needs to be the sort of the man of action, the sort of the person engaged in debate in the marketplace. In fact, there's a really wonderful example of this way of thinking in a dialogue of Plato's called the Gorgias. And there's a character named Callicles who more or less just comes out and says to Socrates, I don't understand why you're such a baby. You know, you stand around philosophizing, that's something for babies. Really, it's, you know, if you're going to be a mature person, you can't spend time being a contemplative. And I think that that's one of the really fascinating features of this ancient debate, is that it provokes this kind of vehemence on both sides. So that's the point of view of Callicles, and then there's the point of view of Aristotle that says, no, actually, rational self-ordering through reflection, through contemplation, is the highest human good. And that tradition gets picked up over and over and over again in the West, including by lots and lots of different writers that I study, John Milton, but also psychoanalysis. And it's not just in the West, it's in Buddhism too, the idea that actually the act of ordering yourself through reason and through reflection is a lifetime pursuit. And so my bias, I'll tell you, is in favor of that point of view. I think that it's right. But at this point in my life, I don't see that there's a lot of support from our culture for this way of looking at things. In fact, I meet people all the time who have more or less stumbled onto the Aristotelian path by accident. They come to understand, as Aristotle said, that actually reflection and inwardness can be an enormous source of rational self-ordering. But they come to understand it almost by accident, and they come to understand it through a sort of pursuit of many different kinds of paths. The people that I talk to who've come to this point of view are often extremely successful scientists or business people, but it's almost like when they discover the idea of the contemplative path, they are doing so without any sort of cultural support. And it seems to me that they sort of, it's like they're coming out of the woods like mad people. It's like, well, we've discovered this secret. Well, look, it's over here. Aristotle said that, you know, this was the way to go. So I think it's a constant struggle in our culture. I mean, and certainly the contempt for the contemplative is massive. I mean, you don't have to go very far to find. You don't have to go back to Plato, certainly, to find the idea that people who want to spend their lives in a sort of pursuit of wisdom are just silly. Like, why would you do that? So I think that's the way I would answer the question. Yeah.
I want to ask, why is it either? Why can it not live in a hybrid world where you can? The only thing that I feel like is good to break is the immediate reaction.
Yeah.
To break that, it's okay then to act, be biased to act, but come with a very good alignment between your values, your thoughts.
Yep.
Versus your.
Yeah. So this is what I want to get to here is the strain in Western thought that has to do with how to bring action and contemplation together. So I'll sort of end with that, because I think it's actually, there's a long tradition of people trying to sort of tell us how to do it, or how they have done it. And I think it's fascinating. So I'll start with actually a writer who I love very much, Franz Kafka. In 1913, Kafka was working at an office job at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute in his native city of Prague. And he was struggling desperately to find time to write stories. His effort was enormous, and so was the toll on his psychic life. He worked in the office from early morning until mid-afternoon, then he napped. He did 10 minutes of exercises and had dinner with his youngest sisters, and finally, at 10:30, but often not until 11 I sit down to write and go on, depending on my strength, inclination, and luck, until 1, 2, or 3 o'clock. Once even till 6 in the morning, and then again, more exercise, then a wash, and then usually with a slight pain in my heart and twitching stomach muscles, to bed. So he really struggled and suffered during this period of his life, and his diary entries grow increasingly forlorn. He writes angst, neurasthenia, and so forth and so on, until all of a sudden he had a kind of a breakthrough, and he wrote several stories in the space of 3 months, including The Metamorphosis. And when he did so, he wrote this entry in his diary. He said, "The tremendous world I have inside my head, but how to free myself and how to free it without being torn to pieces. And 1,000 times I'd rather be torn to pieces than to retain it in me or bury it. That indeed is why I'm here. That is quite clear to me." So I'm fascinated by this. And writers often refer to the tremendous worlds inside their heads, worlds that are sometimes more vivid, more colorful, and present to them than the world outside. So this is a very, very ancient belief that writers have. They've called this inner world a garden, a tract to till and to cultivate. They've called it an ocean. Kafka famously called it a frozen sea. He said, "A book must be an axe for the frozen sea inside us." I believe that. They've called it heaven and hell. But deep in the sort of, if you sort of trace this idea out in the history of Western writing, there's the idea that the mind is a vast and separate space that we can fruitfully explore, and it's really, the exploration of it is central to art, central to literature, central to psychoanalysis, and now I think central, what's interesting to me is it's central to the conversion of neuroscience and mindfulness practice. So there's a term, mindsight, that comes from an emerging field in neuroscience. There's a fellow named Daniel Siegel who's written several books about this topic. But like Henry Thoreau and many others, he argues that mindsight, namely the capacity to become consciously aware of our own inner landscape, is actually a practice that can be cultivated. He says it's the basic skill that underlies everything we mean when we speak of having social and emotional intelligence. Long before neuroscientists developed this approach, writers were passionate advocates for mindsight. Thoreau obsessively observed his inner landscape. The poet, he said, must be continually watching the moods of his mind as the astronomer watches the aspects of the heavens. Rather than traveling to catalog the natural world, we would do well to stay home and study the universe inside. This practice is almost deeply, almost existentially democratic. Thoughts are thoughts. They are equally powerful, equally worthy of study, no matter whose mind they happen to light upon. A meteorological journal of the mind, says Thoreau. You shall observe what occurs in your latitude, I in mine. Thoreau's friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, made a lifetime study of this inner landscape, or what he called the discrepance between his inner landscape and the outer world. So he tells us repeatedly how important this is to him. But, like Plato and Kant, there's a lot of idealist philosophers, including Emerson, who believe that our real life lies beyond outer experience. Only the inner world touches on this real life, which Emerson thought came from the mind of God, as these transcendentalists did. So the outer world is tricky and slippery, but the inner world is the real world. And this tradition goes all the way back again to the ancient world. So deep in writers' bones lurks the belief that in order to flourish, in order to be true, in order to be right, action needs to put down its roots into the inner life. The inner lives of writers may be crowded, colorful, messy, and vital as a street fair on a sunny afternoon, but many writers argue that the key to acting well and effectively lies here, inside the carnival. Effective action is like an engine. The inner world is the crankshaft. If the pistons aren't attached, the cylinders cannot fire. If we don't have access to our interiority, we will not have the capacity to act. Unless we take a good long look around inside, and I really believe this. I'm just going to stand by this view because I think it's true. Artists tell us over and over and over again our actions are going to be deformed. So sometimes writers can assert this belief merely by arching an eyebrow at somebody whose actions have rather famously gone off the rails. After her husband died, Joan Didion came across a booklet from his Princeton class called Lives of 1954. One entry was from Donald H. Rummy Rumsfeld, who noted, "After Princeton, the years seem like a blur, but the days seem more like rapid fire." Joan Didion writes, "I thought about this. I thought about this. The writer's response to the man of action, the moralist's response to the wayward warrior, go inside and look around, or your aim will be off." I'm going to end with an image. It's a beautiful image for me from the writer Annie Dillard, who is a contemporary follower of Thoreau. And to me, it stands as the kind of living answer to the sort of questions posed by the ancient debate between the active and the contemplative life. So Dillard has described her own writing as a living instrument that makes its own path by the very act of traveling down it. It's a path made by walking. And to me, this image could stand for the path that the contemplative person carves out for herself or himself. A box canyon at the end of the path, not clear, but we attend. And here's what she writes. When you write, you lay out a line of words. The line of words is a miner's pick, a woodcarver's gouge, a surgeon's probe. You wield it, and it digs the path that you follow. Soon you find yourself deep in new territory. Is it a dead end, or have you located the real subject? You will know tomorrow or this time next year. You make the path boldly and follow it fearfully. You go where the path leads. At the end of the path, you find a box canyon. You hammer out reports, dispatch bulletins. The writing has changed in your hands, and in a twinkling, from an expression of your notions to an epistemological tool. The new place interests you because it is not clear. You attend. So I'm going to stop there and open up the floor and see if anybody has any questions.
I have a question.
Yep.
With these insights, what have you found the conversation to be about higher education's respect of the cultivation of the contemplative ability to anchor and ground and guide the intellectual knowledge that may be learned in an institution of higher education?
It's a wonderful question, and it's one that I struggle with every day, every week, every year as a humanist at Stanford. As it's no secret to all of you that this is probably the great question of our time, and I don't have any answers. I struggle.
Or do you feel somewhat in a small voice?
I think it's a massively important conversation. I think it's one that I hear going on all around me, not necessarily in the terms laid out by these philosophers, but the conversation is there all the same. And it's the question of how do I fashion a self that I can live with in a market world, in a world that asks me more or less to treat other people as means rather than as ends, as instruments rather than as full selves. And I think that this conversation is constant. I hear a tremendous amount of anxiety about it. I think it's the conversation of our moment. And I don't have any answers to it, but I listen to it. I listen to it all the time, as I'm sure you do too. Yeah.
You didn't talk about the kind of neurotic, self-deprecating thoughts. Did you hear me?
Erotic self-deprecating?
Neurotic.
Oh, neurotic self-deprecating.
Yeah, just, going, oh, I'm feeling, the mystery of creation. It might be some sort of petty junk. Like, oh my God, I look terrible today, my hair's a mess.
So to me, one of the wonderful things about spending time with artists is that they are so honest about their antisocial impulses, including the kind of crap that is in our heads all the time. So one of the writers that I revere is William Wordsworth, and he's a great poet in part because he's willing to mine all of the stuff that goes on in his head that is just trivial, nasty, sort of sexually domineering, unpleasant, uninteresting to other people, and just kind of bad. But he's willing to go there. And I think that actually that's one of the great gifts that great artists can give us, is a willingness to say, yeah, I have tremendous antisocial impulses. I have all kinds of stuff in my head and in my mind that I'm really uncomfortable with. But actually, the gift of mind sight, or the gift of looking inward, is being able to sit with that stuff and not being afraid of it, or not feeling like you have to pretend it isn't there. It's true that many artists are kind of eccentric, but actually there's studies that show that eccentric people live longer and live happier than other people, in part because they're just kind of willing to. I mean, look, all of us have stuff going on in our heads all the time that we wouldn't necessarily want other people to know about, that is either just silly or trivial or stupid or bad or ugly. And yet the willingness to really be comfortable with that, I think, is one of the gifts of this artistic contemplative tradition that I have been studying and I'm interested in. I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but yeah, the stuff that the meteorological journal of your mind, as Thoreau puts it, isn't going to be all beautiful sunsets, right? There's going to be stuff in there that's actually kind of nasty. Yep.
So to build on some of that, the conversation that goes on, so I just graduated from the School of Business, and a lot of the courses around there that they try to teach for leadership is around action.
Yep.
There's paths to power. It's words, actions you can take to build power as a leader. And
Yep.
there's training for us as entrepreneurs to how to seize a market opportunity and take action on that. And now that I've actually followed through on that and trying to build a company, I find that people want more than just a workplace. And then so these are the people I'm hiring, and then I
Yep.
think, how do I create space for that? And there was no training in the business school to prepare on any of that. And I wonder, I find that this lecture is really fascinating to me, because it actually there's a gap in many of the other founders and companies that I've talked to.
Yep.
The soullessness within these companies in Silicon Valley. And so what is being done to bridge that conversation, or to insert even a bit of this conversation into the business school curriculum? Because even for the guest speakers that we have come in, Lisa Rice, or and then Eric Schmidt from Google, they come
Yep.
in and they just tell the students, us, like, it's about action, acting fast, or quickly, if you have an emotion, bring it out so we can take action. There's no break at all in the business momentum, and you're only rewarded for speed of decisiveness. So I feel that there's 0% of that content that touches on this.
Yep.
That's maybe needed.
Well, I mean, there's no question that we're talking about the higher echelons of American capitalism. And the higher echelons of American capitalism are enormously successful at doing what they do best, which is making money. And so making products that people want to use and making money. These companies aren't, they're not worried about the question of how we fashion ourselves in a market world so that we can actually live with ourselves. That's not the question that they're interested in. But if they were going to ask me about that question, what I would say is that autonomy is the master value of the modern world. And if you talk about people on the left, liberals, autonomy of person is the master value. And if you talk about people on the right, conservatives, autonomy of contract is the master value. So American liberalism, corporate capitalism worships autonomy. And autonomy has some wonderful virtues to it, but it also can be enormously enervating. It can lead to a tremendous sense of disconnection, distress, a sort of lack of community. And I think that, I think we're sort of seeing the consequences of that now in our political life. So given that autonomy is the master virtue or the master value, and in some ways the only value, how do we try to orient ourselves in relation to that? And I think that's really the question that you're asking, and it's a very profound question.
I think right now the capitalism actually does demand that. People are going and striking approval for that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
The executives of Uber were largely like willing to do inaction on what should, like, so even for the echelons of capitalism, it's impacting the bottom line. And so I think that is a gap in the conversation, is that we're not trained to handle these situations.
No.
Stanford's producing leaders that don't know how to handle this. I'm speaking for myself, where I don't know how to handle some of these situations. And I feel that this conversation is one that needs to be addressed now.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have an answer to that question because I'm an English professor and a harmless drudge. I'm not a titan of capitalism, but I do watch and I do care a lot about our culture. What I would say is that to me, when the Dalai Lama says that kindness is my religion, that actually does a lot of work in this kind of question. So I'll just sort of leave that there. Yeah.
I add that your reference to Mindsight and Dan Siegel's work is a resource that you referenced that you may want to explore.
Yeah, I think Dan Siegel's work is amazing, actually, and what's so incredible about it is that it is so close to the work of all of these other artists, writers, philosophers going back to the ancients who have come to the same conclusion without the benefit of his neuroscientific training. Yep.
I studied computer science.
Yep.
And the school was quite punishing and competitive. And I look at how we kind of approach the world, and really, as Echoing themselves, it doesn't tell us what. It doesn't equip us with the perspectives that I think comes with humanities courses. And not to say that people should just major in engineering or just to major in art society, to say be practical and utilitarian in this world and pick engineering. It's incredibly dangerous to have more and more engineers coming out of schools without an appreciation for the history. And what struck me the most was David Foster Wallace's speech on This Is Water.
Yep.
Is that engineers don't see the water. They don't see how colonialism has impacted us. They don't see as much as, not that they don't, and yes, there's more the movement of gender equality, etc. But there's not enough of the perspective on how history has influenced us over the years and how philosophy has influenced us over the years. And do you think it's the responsibility of
So it's a good question. I don't have a normative answer. I'm not interested, frankly, in. I'm interested in showing people what's out there and not, in some ways, demanding that they go and look. So I think that I'm not somebody who really believes that that Stanford or other kinds of universities need to be demanding that people take humanities classes. I'm just not. I think that people are. I know from my own life that I'm much more inclined to be interested in stuff that I go and find on my own, rather than that I go and find through a set of requirements. So I just, that's sort of my prior belief. But I think that to me the big sort of blind spot of Silicon Valley in particular is the idea that humans are infinitely malleable, and I just don't think they are. I think humans are unbelievably stubborn and actually kind of resistant to being shaped by either economic incentives or by solutions that come to us from engineering. And I think that maybe so what I think is that a study of history and a study of philosophy could actually give us a little bit more respect for the stubborn resistance of humans to having their problems solved or to being the subject of certain kinds of what we might call rational economic experiments. Yep.
My understanding of behavioral economics is limited to reading Thinking Fast and Slow
Yep.
a couple of times. So I'm trying to understand action bias clearly.
Yep.
One of the points that Kahneman makes is that we have evolved to be lazy because the caveman had no business running around him. He was not being chased around.
Yep.
How does that jive with action?
Well, so Kahneman's, Kahneman's big insight, or the insight that really began his research, he calls it his eureka moment, was when he was talking to some flight instructors in Israel in the late 1960s. And these flight instructors told him, so you can imagine Danny Kahneman, who was he was a little guy standing there talking to these very, strapping Israeli Air Force instructors. The Air Force instructor said, look, I want to, I know that punishment is more effective than praise. And the way I know that is that when I have a flight cadet who does a bad thing and I punish him, then he inevitably corrects and gets better the next time. But when I have a flight cadet who is really great and I praise him, then he invariably gets worse. And so Danny Kahneman's eureka moment was that actually this, what was causing the behavior was not, in fact, the intervention of the instructor, but mere mean regression. So, in fact, typically, somebody does bad, then the next time maybe they do a little bit better, or somebody does really well, then the next time they do a little bit worse. It had absolutely nothing to do with the sort of intervention of the flight instructor. And in fact, this kind of bias is sort of well known. So Sports Illustrated has long been the sort of the subject of just such an illusion, where if you're a really great athlete and you end up on the cover of Sports Illustrated, chances are you're going to end up having a sort of cold streak after the fact. Well, it turns out that ending up on the cover of Sports Illustrated just happens to coincide with the sort of peak of your powers. So the insight of behavioral economics is that people overestimate their own capacity to control the situation by intervening in it, if you see what I mean. And I think from that insight a lot of the contemporary scene of behavioral economics has come, but I don't really think that we've adequately absorbed it, actually. I mean, people love to talk about Kahneman, they love to talk about Kahneman Tversky, but actually this insight that we're sort of subject to this illusion that we can actually sort of make things happen by intervening in them is so profound that I don't actually think we've kind of understood it, or I don't really think that it's come fully into the collective consciousness. I think it's going to take a very long time for it to do that, if it ever does. So I think that's my answer. Yeah, Grayson.
How have smartphones changed how you think about this? Like, to me, they're like the highest ideal of like exploiting that or all these cognitive biases,
Yeah.
and then also they like kind of get in the way of contemplation.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're all reading the same pieces in the New York Times that I am about how Silicon Valley tech executives now view their products as like tobacco, and they're not giving them to their kids. I mean, what can I say? You know, I'm as addicted to my smartphone as anybody else. But as a friend of mine once said, if you can't go more than 5 days without something, then you're basically dependent on it. And I think smartphone dependence is a real problem. I mean, what's your view of the matter? What can I say? I mean, we're kind of hosed. I mean, right? Yeah. I mean, it would be nice if an app could give us the capacity actually to, there are all kinds of apps for contemplation, but really it's hard to focus on the app when really what you want to be doing is checking your Instagram feed. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a big problem. Yeah.
Two comments. Thank you for saying that about Stanford MBA. Because
Yeah.
I'm currently getting an MBA in like this little granola crunching Vermont college.
Excellent.
And in mission driven organizations, and we had to take 4 semesters of personal leadership development.
Excellent.
So they really, if we don't know ourselves, it's not their fault.
Right.
By the time we leave. But my other life is that I'm a minister.
Ah.
And what you said about, kind of what we need to do now, our big question for this world is how do I fashion myself, in this market creation?
Right.
As I'm just about to take start a new church in a couple of weeks. And that's my question. It's funny, I went and preached there, you have to go try out basically.
Yep.
And when I was done, one of the guys came up to me that owns his own business, and he's like, it was good, except you didn't tell us what to do. And I thought, well, I'm waiting to hear.
Yeah.
And he keeps pushing me, and he says, what are you going to do when you first get here? I said, I'm going to listen. For the first, yes, I got to preach on Sunday, we're going to change worship, y'all won't know what chit chat, but I'm going to listen to you all.
Yeah.
And he didn't know what to do. And I think that's, the churches in this, the Christian churches in this rummage sale, period right now, where we got to throw away a lot of things and make room for new things. But that's one of them. And the question for myself as a minister who's organizing worship is, how do I turn that time into contemplation and teaching people? And I do a centering prayer when we have like silence, when people just have to sit with themselves. And I watch New Englanders be able to do this, which is shocking.
Yeah.
But that's I think where we are too, is that how do we the history of the recent Christian church at least has been, okay, I'm going to fix the world, and I'm going to, fix things. We're going to make it a good place to be.
Yeah.
And I want to say to them, yeah, you still need to act, but you need to sit and listen to yourselves. Don't expect me as your minister to come in and tell you what to do. You all have great ideas among you.
Yeah.
Like, let them come out. And if this week I say something and you think about it and you can't figure out how to act, oh well. Come back next week and see what, let's talk about it. Let's think of something, and maybe it's not act. Maybe we just are for a while. And that some of us act and some of us be, and we've got to have the be and the acting too. So that's, I think, the struggle that I'm facing.
And I think that's a really beautiful point. I mean, my question about how do you fashion a self that seems integrated and coherent in a market world has intentional echoes with a very, very old question in Christianity, which is about how to fashion a self that can be saved in a fallen world. I mean, my book is not, it's not a Christian, or that's not the perspective of the book. But I do think the question is similar, and I think it's a very, very ancient one, is how do you make sense, how do you come to a sort of sense of integrity or integration in a world that's asking you to be atomized and to be autonomous.
That's that old of the world, in
yeah.
the world, but not
Yeah,
of it.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's, that we struggle with. But
Right, yeah, and that's really the question. So, yeah.
Kind of to that point, what I find really striking as a practice is kind of Thoreau's attempts to strip away all of the things that he doesn't really fundamentally need. And I think that's even more important now, since
Yep.
The market sort of imposes certain so-called needs on us. So
Yep.
we're saying, things that may have been beneficial to us in our distant past are no longer. So I think it's really helpful as a contemplative practice to think about the timeless things that we as human beings really need and that actually nurture us. It's just very difficult to do that in our current society because the market is predicated on us consuming and needing things.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of, for me at least, a way to orient my personal values and from there my actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this question a lot in my teaching, and I've come to the view that it's almost impossible to teach anybody anything, but somehow we learn in each other's presence. And so that has led me to a really belief in a kind of radical, democratic sense of what it is to teach, that actually I learn. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it's really true. I learn way more from my students than they do from me, and my teaching is successful when it's all heads together working on a problem, not me telling people what to think. And I think that for me is the way out of the current predicament, is a sense of where we can find it: ritual, solidarity, connectedness, human cohesion. I mean, we desperately need each other, right? I mean, this is what we need from each other, is a sense of being together and learning from each other, not each a separate atom. So I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
Just kind of follow up on that, thinking about all of these kind of wants and needs that we kind of think we have, and coming back to what you said about sort of rooting your action in yourself or in the mind, and when the mind is such a turbulent place and it's not clear what are the real kind of wants and needs, and what are the kind of shadows, and how do these authors talk about, I guess through contemplative practice,
Yeah.
how do they talk about just kind of getting in touch with what those genuine wants and needs and values are?
Yeah, I mean, so there's in Buddhist thought, it's clear that the mind is like the sky and thoughts are like the clouds, and part of what it is to develop a contemplative practice in Buddhism is to be able to separate the clouds from the sky. In the tradition that I'm talking about, that it's less clear what the process is, except I think that so John Milton, a writer I revere, talks about coming to the upright heart and pure. That's his ideal for what a human life should be, and for him that's a lifelong process of actually learning to have an upright heart and pure, and learning to have a kind of well, I mean, it's a form of integrity. So I don't think there's a clear answer, except that for all of these writers, It's a process that unfolds and unfolds and unfolds across a lifetime of just trying to know yourself, and that's really hard. It's really hard for the reasons that Kahneman talks about, is that we're sort of stuck with these incredible illusions about how things actually work, and to try to get behind them is actually, I think, part of the task of the contemplative person. Yeah. How are we doing for time, Tia?
You have been generous, and we can end if it's time, if you'd like, if you want to take.
Why don't we take one more question and then we'll end, yeah.
There's two parts to this question.
Yep.
One is that, what is your own
I
benefit
would
as you
invite
practice?
people to stay, just so we can properly thank.
Yeah, no, it's fine if people need to go, but yeah.
I can come and talk to you separately. We can end.
Okay, well, why don't we? Sure. Why don't we end and let people go if they need to go, and then you and I can talk. So thank you very
Let's
much.
just thank.
Thank you. Great.